Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Job, the Sefer Iyov. We are about to begin the study of chapter 36, Perek Lamed Vav. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of this podcast. In the last chapter, 35, we were reading the continuation of Elihu's speech, and Elihu's speech will continue today in chapter 36 and on through the end of chapter 37. And Elihu, as we have seen so far, has been making points which haven't necessarily been made during the conversation between Iyov and his friends, and points which bring us a little bit closer towards understanding, to some extent, the question of theodicy. Don't expect Elihu to give us the answer, because nobody gives us the answer, which is why after Elihu, God himself has to speak and still leave us without the answer. So, but Elihu does bring in concepts which are important for us to recognize, that gives us a better understanding of how to handle this difficulty, this incongruence that we experience between what we think justice should look like and the actual lives that we live, especially in the face of terrible suffering. So, Vayosef Elihu, and again, before I read this chapter, just to remind you, the last chapter, the points that Elihu had made was that it's important to recognize that we're not giving things to God. God doesn't have any benefit from the things we do, and God doesn't get hurt when we sin against him. God is God. He's not affected by human interaction. It is us. It is this society. It is human beings that are affected by, our evils. We make it worse for us, ourselves, and for everyone around us. And it is human beings that benefit when we act well. So therefore, in other words, Elihu is warning us not to think of it as if, we do something nice for God, as if there's some sort of transaction here, because God has no interest in what we do. And also, he mentioned at the end that we have to understand that even though God is just, God is in it for the long game, so to speak. He's in it for the long haul, in ways which we cannot appreciate. We don't see instant justice. Now, in chapter 36, he's going to continue mentioning some other points that are important in understanding this subject of theodicy. So, Vayosef Elihu Vayomar. So, Elihu continued and added more points, Vayomar, and he said as follows: Katar li ze'er, va'achaveka. Wait for me a little bit, and I will say some more things. Ki od le'lo amilim. There are still more things to say regarding God. There's more points that I need to make. Esod de'i lemerachok. I will raise up. In other words, I will make people aware of my knowledge. In other words, of my wisdom, of the things that I want to say, lemerachok, to faraway places. People will know it all over. Ulefo'ali etain tzedek. And to he who created me, I am going to attribute justice. So I'm going to show that he is just. Ki amnam lo sheker miloi, because you should know, because in truth, my words are not false. Timim deos imach. There is a man who is pure in his knowledge who is here with you now. This guy, in other words, me, who's talking with you, I'm a person that has solid, good, true knowledge that I'm sharing with you. So then, so he says, wait for me, I have more to say, listen up. Okay, so now what is it that he wanted to say? So he's going to start doing that in verse 5. So if you remember, the point that he just ended with in the previous chapter was, the main point was that God isn't affected by the things that we do, right? So if he isn't affected, you can draw several conclusions, right? One possible conclusion is we have no effect on God. We can't change him. He has no benefit from us when we do good things. He doesn't get hurt when we do bad things. So if that's the case, maybe he doesn't care what we do, right? Or maybe he doesn't even know, right? So the first point that he makes in verse 5 is Hein el kabir velo yimas. He is a powerful and mighty God, right? Velo yimas. He is not yimas often means to be disgusted with something, but yimas also means to be hateful or spiteful towards something. In other words, he doesn't reject this world. He does care about this world. Kabir koach lev. God has a powerful strength in his heart. So, in other words, obviously God doesn't have a heart, but what he means is koach lev, the might of God's awareness is tremendous. So it's not true that he doesn't know what's going on. It's not true that he doesn't care. He does care, right? So don't think, because that's one potential answer to the question of theodicy, and that is that God just doesn't care, right? So he's saying, no, that's not what's happening here. Lo yichayeh rasha. He is not the one who gives life, who gives sustenance to the wicked. What he means here by give life, give sustenance, he's not the one that set up a system which pushes goodness and supports and sustains and nurses, so to speak, the Russia, the wicked people. That's not what he does, right? In other words, that's what a spiteful God, a God that wouldn't care, would be. That's not how. That when God allows a wicked person to prosper, it's not because God wants to give prosperity to wicked people. Umishpat aniyim yitain. He will give judgment to the poor. So he's asserting this fact, even though it's not necessarily something that we see again, but he's affirming that it's not God, right, that gives this sustenance to the Rasha. And don't worry, he does give justice to the poor. And then that was verse 6. Verse 7, Lo yigra mitzadik einav, right? He does not take his eyes away from the righteous. Don't think that he just ignores what the righteous people are doing. He knows what they're doing, right? The fact that they don't instantaneously get goodwill and instantaneously get a big prize, because they did something good, it's not because he's not watching. He's watching. V'es milochim lakisei. He is watching the kings on their thrones, right? He knows what they're doing when they sometimes do good or bad. It's not because sometimes we wonder why this country or why this nation or this king's kingdom is doing well and the other one's not doing well. If this one's such a righteous person, that one's not. He knows. Vayoshiveim lanetzach. He is the one who seats them literally forever. What does this mean, right? This tzaddik and this melech, this king, God is establishing for him something that's much more permanent, something that's forever. Vayigbahu, and he raises him up. This king will have the one who's righteous and good, the tzaddik who is good. They will have their day, so to speak. They will achieve actual eternity. Even though you don't see it today, they will, and they do have actual eternity. Ve'im asurim bazikim, and if they are, if you see that people that are the tzaddik, the good person, right, are tied up in chains, right? Yilochdun b'chavlei oni, and if they are caught up in the ropes of affliction, of suffering, of poverty. Vayaged lahem pa'olam. So that was verse 8. We're about to read verse 9. So if the righteous person is tied up and suffering, because I just told you, right, that God doesn't ignore the tzaddik. God watches them. He knows them, right? And he's in it for the long game. They will be established for eternity. There will be a justice for them. They will have the eternity that they deserve. However, if you see them now and you see that they are right now suffering, tied in chains and wrapped in the sufferings related to poverty, so then in those circumstances, and what he's going to talk about, and I'm just going to kind of give this away a little bit, is that suffering is often an opportunity for us to improve. Even though it's very similar to the concept we find in Chazal of Yisur and Shalava, suffering of love, and suffering to give someone greater reward. But over here, it's not so much, suffering now so that I give you instead of giving you a Chevy at the end, I'm going to give you a Mercedes Benz. That doesn't mean because you suffered more. What it means is that suffering is an opportunity for growth, right? A tzaddik, a good person, can have suffering, and sometimes it may not necessarily be a punishment. It has to be taken by the person going through it as an opportunity for growth. So through that suffering, verse 9, Vayaged lahem pa'olam, God will tell them about their actions. In other words, will tell them. Doesn't necessarily mean that he's a prophet and God's going to come and talk. But the person will learn about, he'll search out his life. He'll see, what have I done wrong? What have I done that might have led to this suffering? Ufishe'em ki iskabaru. And God will, by this method, will let them know what their sins are that are too excessive, that are too large, that are too big, that are too powerful. In other words, so that the person going through this will use this as an opportunity to search through their life and search through their actions and search through their traits and characteristics to see, where did I go wrong? What did I do? Okay? So what he's arguing for here, Elihu, is he's not stating that it's necessarily just some sort of just punishment, right? That he's getting punished, and now but he's saying that when the tzaddik is suffering, he uses that suffering as an opportunity for self-reflection. Vayigel oznom lamusar, and he he opens their ears to rebuke, right? Vayomer ki yushuvun me'aven, and he says, God, right, says that through this suffering they will return from bad ways. So in other words, he's admitting that this person is a tzaddik, right? Elihu. He's saying this person is a righteous person and a person who doesn't necessarily deserve the punishment or the suffering that he's getting. But nonetheless, that suffering will still help him grow into a better person. So Elihu is giving us a slight path towards understanding the question of theodicy. That is, sometimes suffering is not because you deserve it, but still you should use it as an opportunity to grow and then become a better person for it down the road, become a stronger person for it. Im yishma'u, right? If they do listen and they do use it as an opportunity for growth, via avodu, and they work, right? Meaning the avodu here is work and worship God and serve God, then yichalu yimehem betov, they will complete out their days in good. Because such people, and you're going to see this as we go through the whole context, so you might not see this in this verse, but you'll see it as we keep reading, where I'm getting this from. But Yichalu Yimehem Batov, their days will end in good. This sounds like Elihu almost talking like the friends of Eov, who gave him this guarantee that if you repent, then God's going to give you everything back and everything's going to be good. But that's not what it means, because especially since that's not what we always see. Sometimes innocent people just die and never see the good that we see. So the point over here is they end their days, because if you don't use suffering as an opportunity for growth, then you end up using suffering as an opportunity, not so much an opportunity, the suffering turns you into someone who's angry, who's spiteful, who loses his relationship with God, and you end up being arrogant even in the suffering, right? So, and you end up not caring about other people, you end up not caring about yourself, you end up not working on yourself, so the suffering itself turns you into an angry, bitter person. But these people, if you do listen and you do stick with God, then yichalu yimehem batov, your days will end in good, because you will remain faithful, you will remain on target despite the suffering. Ushnehem ba'neimim, and their years will end with sweet, and in a sweet way. So you can, despite suffering, still stay on the right path. In fact, use the suffering to force you to become even better. However, ve'im lo yishmu, if they don't listen, in other words, they're suffering and they then get angry at God, then Bashelach Ya'avoru, they're going to end up cut down by the sword. They're going to end up fighting. They're going to end up bitter. And many of us, you can think of, people in poverty, people suffering, people going through a terrible life. Sometimes you meet them and they're the nicest people. They're making the best do with what they have. They don't have a nice house. They don't even have a house. They don't have a car, but they're always smiling. They're always working through. They're always saying, don't worry, I'll keep going. I'll make it through. Now, he's still suffering terribly, but that person can be happy as he goes through it. But if you don't, what happens? You become bitter, you end up fighting, and in the end, what is it? Bashelach Ya'avoru, you fight, eventually you get killed in a brawl, and that's the end of it. V'yigvu'u b'vli das, and they end up dying without any knowledge, without having gained any knowledge from or experience from the suffering that they went through. V'chanfei lev, because those who are chanfei lev, and what's a chanfei lev? A person who is a mechanef is a person who literally it translates to a flatterer of the heart. So what does it mean? A person guilty of chinuf is a person who thinks that you can pay anyone off with anything. He looks at the world in a transactional way, right? I can get what I want if I grease the right palms, in other words. So those people that live that way, that kind of relationship they have with God is they look at it the same. They look at it in a transactional way. And Elihu is telling us now we shouldn't be looking at our relationship with God in a transactional way. It doesn't work that way because God doesn't care about the things we pay him off with, right? But those that are chanfei lev, how do they end up? Yasimu off. They end up becoming full of anger. Lo yishavu. They refuse to cry out to God. They refuse to pray. They refuse to remain faithful. Ki asaram, because God, has imprisoned them. So what he's saying here is that they look at it and say, well, God has been evil to me. God has imprisoned me. God has made me poor. So therefore, I'm angry, right? And this anger leads to bad things. In the end, it leads to failure. So what he's doing here also, of course, is warning Eov to stay away from the path of anger at God despite the suffering that he's going through. What happens to these people again, verse 14? Tamos banoar nafsham, their soul dies when they are still youthful. What does this mean? They have an immature understanding of God. They have an immature understanding of how the world works. So as everything's going fine, they think, yeah, it's great. But if things start to go bad, and they usually do at some point, they refuse to accept it, and they refuse to work their way through it. They refused to worship God and serve God and stay on the right path despite the suffering. They refuse to grow from the suffering. They refuse to look at ways they can improve themselves, how they can live a happy life despite the suffering, or at least do the best they can with what they have, and they end up dying with that same immature outlook that they had. V'chayasam b'kedeshim, then their life ends up among the kedeshim. The kedeshim are the prostitutes, right? In other words, he's portraying an image of the lowest levels in the social rungs of society. That's where they end up because they never get out of it. They never get out of that world. They're constantly in that lowly world. Yichaletz. Okay, so I think verse 14, which I just read, is a good stopping point. It's a long chapter, so it's best if we divide it in two. So we will continue with the second half of chapter 36 in the next podcast, and where Elihu will continue to drive home this point of the importance of using suffering as an opportunity for growth. Thank you so much for studying together with me. Looking forward to finishing this chapter and the rest of this book of Job together. Have a wonderful day.